Hi there, we're going to talk about agency today. Agency is the number one thing I want agents to know about before they enter the marketplace. So agency can be kind of tricky. Agency is incredibly important to understand, and it can get a little bit hairy sometimes when you're in a transaction and you're trying to question whether you should or should not tell something, should or should not do something. And I always bring it back to agency. Who do you represent? What do you owe that person? So the first thing we're going to talk about are the types of agency. So the most common form of agency that a new agent is going to do is going to be buyer's agency. So if you're representing a seller, you are a listing agent and you're going to put your yard sign in the front yard. If you are representing a buyer, you could be one of several different types of agency relationships with that buyer. If I go to Priscilla's listing to show a buyer the house, maybe Priscilla got a cold call on her yard sign and she said, "Hey, Ashley, I don't want to do dual agency, or I'm on vacation, or whatever. I'm tied up. I have a conflict. Would you come over here and show this cold call, the house? And if it converts into a buyer for you, would you pay me a referral fee?" Happy to. Be delighted to do so. And quite frankly, that happens all the time. I don't want you doing dual agency, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute. But Priscilla has asked me to step in and take this cold call through the house. So I go over there. When I arrive, I'm not the listing agent because I'm not Priscilla. It's not my yard sign in the front yard. I did not sign documentation listing the home with the seller. I am at that moment a sub agent. And a sub agent is what SA on the MLS sheet stands for. When you look at commission being offered on the MLS sheet, you see SA no, SA %0. That is a sub agent. That is a sub agent of the seller. It means the seller has given permission for that person, that agent, to come show that house. Because of that, when I am there with that cold lead, with that buyer person, they are a customer to me, and I represent the seller. I represent the seller because I don't represent that buyer yet. So I need to be careful about what I say to that buyer because I'm representing the seller and I can't harm the seller. I'm a sub-agent for the seller. It is my hope, wish, and desire that I'm going to convert that customer, that buyer standing there, into one of my clients. And I do that through an agency relationship with my buyer, with that buyer client. Okay. I want to convert them into being my buyer client, and I am their buyer's agent. At that point, if I've signed an exclusive right to represent buyer agreement with that buyer, when I sign that, I am no longer a sub agent to that buyer, because now I have severed my agency relationship with the seller by entering into an exclusive agency relationship with that buyer. That buyer and I are now tied to each other through an exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. A non-exclusive right to represent buyer agreement also exists. I would prefer you use an exclusive one because it protects you more. But non-exclusive or exclusive right to represent buyer agreement severs the ties with the seller and commits you to that buyer. And now you are no longer a sub agent. And if you look at the MLS offers of compensation, you will most often see that the listing agent is offering compensation, cooperative compensation, to a buyer's agent, not a sub agent. And when you're filling out listings, I want you to say no to sub agent and 0 to sub agent, yes to buyer's agent, and whatever you're offering to the buyer's agent in that next slot. Because what we hope for is that that buyer is going to have a committed relationship with that buyer's agent, and they're going to represent them all the way through the transaction. Okay, I may have already confused you, and that's okay, because agency is real convoluted. So let's go back to the scenario where I have showed up at Priscilla's listing. I have met a buyer and I'm going to walk that buyer through the property. What I'm going to do while I'm there is I'm going to show up and I'm going to say, hey, Betty buyer, I'm happy to show you the house. I'm glad Priscilla gave me your number. Are you ready to go in and see the house? And before we go in, I'm just going to let you know, no pressure. I'm going to show you the house, but unless I represent you to purchase a home, I have to be careful about what I divulge about the seller and their position with this house. But good news, I've never met the seller or talked to the seller, so I probably don't actually know any real confidential information about the house. So you're welcome to ask me any questions while we're in here, and I'm going to, tell you all the things I know about the house. Also, I brought you the MLS listing printout. That's going to be the public version, of course, and it's going to be branded with my information on it. And when we finish up that tour, I'm going to say to that buyer customer, well, what do you think? Anybody you want to bring back to take a look at the house? Is this one does it meet your search criteria? Is this one you would think about purchasing? And if they say yes or no, I'm going to enter into a conversation with them about representing them. Well, I'd be more than happy to help you write that up. Can we talk about how, I need to do an agency agreement with you so that I have the right to work with you? If not, I'm supposed to, at that point, I've not had a substantive conversation about that property. And the reason why you have to get something in writing with everybody would be if you have a substantive conversation about a specific property with them. If I've gone through the house with them and all I've talked about are the things on that public MLS sheet, that's all public record. I would not, and this is my opinion, I would not say that rises to the level of a substantive conversation. We're having a conversation about a specific property, but it's not substantive. The same way I feel about visitors to open houses. I'm going to keep it light and breezy. And I am not going to get into anything that is not on that public MLS sheet, because then I know I'm safe. I don't have to do an agency disclosure with them. The state law says we have to do an agency disclosure form in writing as soon as we have a substantive conversation about a specific property. Okay. Now, there is a form you can use if they don't want to hire you. If you want to have a substantive conversation with them, but they don't want to hire you, you're supposed to get the disclosure of brokerage for an unrepresented party signed. I'm not recommending you even commit that to memory, because I don't want you having substantive conversations with buyer customers. To get the benefit of your real estate knowledge and your real estate value, they need to commit to some sort of working relationship with you. And there is no reason to go deep dive on substantive matters like, will the seller take XYZ? Will the seller do this or that? There's no reason to have that conversation when you're just tire kicking at an open house or on a first viewing. Okay. But just be aware of it and try not to answer questions that are substantive. You can certainly say, you know what, I'm happy to reach out to the seller and find out and get back to you. That's perfectly fine. May I have your phone number? Now we're, cooking along towards an agency relationship with them. So that is sub-agency, and then converting into buyer's agency. And that, if I were the listing agent, if I were Priscilla and I got a cold call and I was in town, I would absolutely go show that house to the cold call. And what I would say to them is, hey, Betty buyer, so nice for you to meet me out here today. Just as a friendly reminder, and I do this while I'm standing by my yard sign, just as a friendly reminder, tap, tap, I represent the seller on this transaction. So if you find that this is the home you've got to have, I have wonderful agents who work with me, wonderful colleagues who I'm happy to call and see if they'll, help you write up an offer on this house. If it turns out this house does not quite meet your search criteria, then I'm more than happy to talk with you after, and we can see about putting you on a subscription on my MLS, an auto email on my MLS, to look for other similar properties that may meet your needs a little better. This is just me being selfish. I'm not going to give away a buyer client if it's not the house for them. I'm going to give away a buyer client in order to avoid doing dual agency, but I'm not going to give away a buyer client unless I have to. So as the listing agent, I'm going to show them that house, but I'm going to be very clear that I represent the seller. and I'm not going to have a substantive conversation with them about anything in that house. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that before we go? Please, Rita. Let me request you unmute. Rita, did you have something to ask? I requested you unmute. Will it let you click that button?
Okay, so if you're still in a position where you're just meeting a cold person.
Yes, a customer. Yep.
Okay, and so you have knowledge of things that maybe only a seller's agent should have. Okay, so, and then let's say you're not the listing agent, but you're doing an open house for somebody. You heard some people talking about to the listing agent about something. And so let's say you just somehow came across some information. All right, but the person that you're talking to is not your your client yet.
Yes.
Still a customer. Once they become a customer, is that information still considered confidential?
So
if it's information that's...
I do try to be very careful to not learn things about the property that are confidential.
Mhm.
And if it is something that is confidential,
like let's say a listing agent says they really want to get rid of this property. I know they probably take an offer.
I would say that is confidential. A lot of things that people see as confidential. Okay, let me say it this way. Confidential does not exempt it from being a mandatory disclosure by an agent. Okay. So if you hear that the basement takes on water, even if the seller is saying, hey, that's confidential, I don't want people to know that, it is still mandatory for agents to disclose that to any potential buyers. Something like
Right.
They're getting a divorce and they have to sell the house. That is confidential and not a mandatory disclosure item.
Okay.
However, in your scenario, which I think is pretty niche, I don't think you're going to be privy to a lot of that kind of information.
Not these days, but it used to be when you were all in the office.
Yes.
You know.
Yes. Usually you won't know confidential information. This is why I also tell teams, have your own email addresses. Like, do not share an email address. You know, you're asking for trouble to know or not know things that are confidential. So if you, in your scenario, if you knew it once that, this is what I'll say, when you were a sub-agent for that seller, that was confidential and you may not share it. And if you get a buyer client and convert them into a buyer client, if it is a confidential thing, not a mandatory disclosure thing, but a confidential thing, like they're behind on their mortgage payments and they're going to be foreclosed on in a few months, you may not disclose that. It is confidential. Here's a better example, not better example, but here's a more clear example. Let's say I sell a house to my buyer client and then I'm a terrible follow-up person and they list it with someone else. If that was a confidential thing about my buyer that I know, I don't know what it could be, something funky about their finances or funky about their ownership of that home, and it's confidential, not a material defect. It's confidential about that person. I cannot tell it to a buyer client, even if I get a buyer client to buy that listing. That was my old client. It goes to the grave with me. Okay.
All right.
There's a big difference between confidential information and material facts about a house.
Okay.
I would say there are very few material facts about the person that you have to disclose. Bankruptcy, court order stuff, court approval. Those are things that are material facts that probably do need to be disclosed. Almost everything else is just confidential. Now, it's tricky because it requires you to remember that you're a sub-agent until you're not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, That's because the listing belongs to the firm. If somehow you overhear at the gym somebody from a different firm talking about confidential information about their seller, also don't do that. But if you overhear it, our firm does not have an agency relationship with that seller. We don't have the listing agreement. So then I feel you probably could share that with a potential buyer. But also, all of that is real icky, you know. We just want to, and fortunately, people are pretty quiet or tight-lipped about that type of stuff. So don't go to the gym and start talking on the treadmill to your neighbor about your seller, okay? Your current client. Not that y'all would. Okay, so let's talk about dual agency. Dual agency would be if I have a listing and a buyer says, hey, I'd love to see it. And I say, great, I'll meet you at 2 o'clock. And I go over there and I say, tap, tap on the yard sign, just to remind you, I represent the seller, but I'm happy to give you a tour of the house. And we come out and they say, I have to have this house. Write it up. I'm going to say, whoa, hold on. I could. I'm allowed to by law, but Ashley's not going to let me. Okay. I'm really not going to let you do dual agency. I don't think it is good business practice. I am philosophically completely against it, and I'll tell you why. And I think if you're being very rational, you will only be able to agree with me. When I went and sat at that listing appointment with that seller, I went through everything I'm going to be able to do for them. I'm going to negotiate for you. I'm going to make sure I get all the money in the world for you. I'm going to compare all those offers and make sure we're taking the highest and the best offer. That cash offer that was for $5,000 less, I'm going to recommend you take that one, because the other one that was offering more money was FHA, and there's going to be an appraisal. And we're already selling $20,000 over our list price. I'm going to give you, the seller, the benefit of all of my experience, all of my hard work, and my loyalty to you, that I'm going to get you the best transaction I can get you. Oh, I forgot to tell you, unless a buyer comes, then I'm going to give you half of those services. I'm going to get all the commission, and I'm going to give the buyer half of my services as well. So philosophically, it's a terrible deal for everybody except the real estate agent, okay? Because now when it comes time to negotiate, I really can't participate in that. It's got to be seller and buyer decide what they want to do. Well, how am I going to negotiate hard for my seller like I told them I was going to, when it would harm the buyer, who was also my client? So in my mind, yes, what I hear agents tell me is, well, I feel like I could do it fairly. Yes, I agree that you could do it fairly. And I agree that you could do it sort of at arm's length. I do agree that you could do that. I just think it's a terrible deal for the seller and the buyer. So I just don't think why should they want to do that? There are exceptions, obviously, where maybe the money's really tight for the seller, and this would allow the agent to maybe discount their commission and make the net a little higher for that seller and perhaps avoid foreclosure. Yes. But again, that is me cherry picking an example that it would benefit the seller and the buyer. In most cases, it's that the agent just happens to be getting the calls, and the agent says, yippee, now I can represent both and make double the commission. Okay. Again, I just think it ends up being a terrible deal for everybody except the real estate agent. And it is the number one reason why agents get disgruntled clients calling me, not so much nowadays. I've been very lucky that all of y'all have been so wonderful to see how it can bite you in the rear end. But dual agency is perfectly legal. I don't think it's a great idea. I don't think it's best business practice, but it is perfectly legal. And have I done it? Yes, I have done it. There have been a few occasions where this is the test I want you to give yourself. Did you have both of these clients last month? Did you have both the seller and the buyer last month? If you did, you're going to do dual agency because you already are a dual agent. You already have existing agency relationships with both of them. And so in my opinion, that is the only time that I would want to see you do dual agency. The bulk of dual agency is, sweet, I got a hot call on my new listing. Okay. Questions about dual agency? Yes, I've done it. Yes, it's scary. Yes, I don't feel like I was doing my best for either party. Anybody?
I do, Ashley. I got a sign call for some land. I'm probably going to be. I just need unrepresented. I
So,
represent the South.
absolutely, that is my recommendation. And when an agent calls me and is saying, hey, I got to do dual agency because they really want me to write it up, they don't want anybody else. What I say is, you don't have to do dual agency. Just say to that buyer, would it be okay if I wrote up everything, but I didn't represent you? Number one, the commission is, the brokerage is agreed to on that listing agreement. That doesn't change if there is or there isn't a buyer's agent on the other side. Now, you could elect to change it if you wanted to. But what my recommendation always is buyer, I'd be happy to write it up for you. Do you have any idea what you want to offer for it? I can't help you with what you should offer, but I can write it up for you. And then I can take it to the seller. I also am happy to help you, schedule the inspections. I'm happy to meet you out here to, walk the four corners of the property. You just can't do any acts of real estate for that buyer. You just can't let them benefit from your experience and knowledge about real estate. You have to treat them honestly, but they can be an unrepresented buyer. And that, in my opinion, is much better risk-wise for the agent. Is it a better deal for the buyer? Probably not. Having the buyer and the seller each have their own representation is the ideal, because then everybody has someone working for them. But I also understand that the money doesn't work sometimes, or that the seller or the buyer are fine with it. I mean, for sale by owners, we sell for sale by owners all the time. They don't have an agent working for them. They're unrepresented. It goes okay. Do I work harder on those? Yes, as a buyer's agent, but that happens sometimes. So it's not uncommon for there to be a transaction where one party is unrepresented. And Carla, that would be my recommendation to you, is that if you have a buyer who is saying, no, I want you to write it up. We don't want a realtor. Nope, don't need it. We know what we want to offer. Then just have them be unrepresented. The only thing you're going to have to do additionally is you're going to have to do that form, the disclosure of brokerage for an unrepresented party. And I'll put that in the chat window. Here we go. And this is in the VAR library. So if you go,
See Mickey's message there, Ashley?
Yep, I do. Thank you. So you're going to go to the VAR library of forms to find that form. And Miki is asking, how does the commission work in that case if the buyer's unrepresented? Well, you have already, as the listing agent, you've agreed with the seller what the commission is going to be. So the brokerage is going to be whatever you've written into that listing agreement. It doesn't have to be shared with the buyer's agent. It just says that if there is a buyer's agent, what you will share with that buyer's agent. Okay. In most cases, if I were in that situation, I would likely end up altering the total brokerage just for that unrepresented buyer transaction. Not for all of them, because what if that one falls through after the perk test and we're back on the market? So I would be willing to probably alter what commission I had agreed to take with that seller if there is not going to be another agent on the other side. Now, I am never going to take it down to half. I'm going to have them acknowledge with me that there is going to be some effort on my part to work this alone, to work this without another real estate agent. Okay. Especially if it's a house. If it's a house, we've got inspections, we've got, that you have to be on premises for, walkthroughs, all that kind of stuff. So I am going to acknowledge to my seller that I am not willing to just cut it in half, but I am willing to discount it in an effort to show that I understand there's not a buyer's agent over there on the other side. Yep. I hope that answers the question, Miki. Okay, so we have covered dual agency, don't do it. Designated agency is super simple. All it means is that a Wainwright agent brought a buyer to a Wainwright listing, or an MKB agent brought a buyer to an MKB listing. That's all it means. It just means that both parties are being represented by the same firm, not the same agent, the same firm. And that does happen very, very commonly. And when that happens, you need a special form. You need the designated agency consent and confirmation form. And that is in the RVAR library of forms. Easy peasy. It literally says, Ashley will keep working with the seller. Jennifer will keep working with the buyer. And then the seller and the buyer sign it. That's all it is. Now, because I know y'all are A++ students, because y'all are always taking notes, because I can see you doing it, I'm going to give you just a side note about that. What it does do is it makes me a dual agent, because I'm the broker for both the buyer and the seller. So that's the only little funky bit about designated agency. It doesn't change agency for you guys, but it does change for me. I become a dual agent in that case. And then if you want to get real complicated, if I am one of the agents on one of the sides of the transaction, I am a designated agent and a dual agent because I'm the broker. And in that case, we assign Jennifer Wilcox to be the broker in charge of the other side of the transaction. Yeah, I like extra room when it comes to agency. I would never, even though it's not about me, it's not about whether I think I could take off my listing agent hat and be your broker. It's not about that. It's about the optics of it. It's about having an extra high standard when it comes to ethics and treating all parties honestly. And it's about making sure everyone feels comfortable with their representation. Whether I think I could do a good job or not doesn't matter. You know, y'all know I'm conceited enough that I think I could, but there's no reason for it. I've got Jennifer, you know, with her giant broker brain over there, ready, willing, and able to help. So there's no reason. I have no ego wrapped up into any of this. I'm happy to make sure everybody has an extra layer of comfort when it comes to their representation. Okay, so let's talk now. Oh, and just so you know, you're never going to do it, so you don't need to know, but there is a form for dual agency consent and confirmation as well. And understanding this is important, because when you do your listing agreement with your seller, there's going to be a whole page at the back of that exclusive right to represent seller agreement that details what dual agency is and details what designated agency is. Okay. So let's talk about what you owe customers versus clients. And this is where I'm going to remind you that when you're working a transaction, you need to ask yourself multiple times, who do I represent? Because you don't want to disclose confidential things to a buyer if you're the listing agent. You do have to disclose material facts about the house. Those are required disclosures for the listing agent. They are not necessarily required disclosures for the seller. Water coming into the basement, the house being in a flood zone, the roof leaking, the sink in the shed out back doesn't actually have any plumbing. There's just a bucket under it, but the cabinet's locked. Seller doesn't have to disclose any of those things. That happened to me, by the way. That's a real story. Only during the home inspection did we discover that the plumbing was a bucket. So all of those items are not required to be disclosed by the seller, because there is a very, very short list on the summary of obligations form as to what the seller has to disclose. Termite damage, a body buried in the basement. I'm telling you, there is almost nothing sellers have to disclose. Listing agents, buyer's agents, we have to disclose anything that is a material fact about the property that could adversely affect someone's offer. Okay. So all of the things I just listed are things as a listing agent I'm going to tell people. Now, I do not have to go out to the listing and be a home inspector and try to dig up all these facts, okay? But to protect myself during the listing appointment, I'm going to ask my sellers, hey, is there anything about the property that you think is a little funky or broken or is not functioning the way it should? And does your basement ever get any water? I'm going to ask all of those things to protect myself because I don't want to be 2 weeks into a listing agreement and now I'm in a bilateral contract to list this home that cannot be terminated except by both parties and find out that there's something catastrophically wrong with this house. And now I have to tell all buyers about it. And the seller is applying pressure on me to not disclose it. I'm not going to get myself in that type of situation. So I'm going to ask those hard questions at the listing appointment, and then I'm going to get in front of them. I'm going to say, okay, well, what are we going to do about that foundation crack that a company came out and told you about? What are we going to do about how the termite company who does your routine maintenance came in and said that they found live termites? We need to do something about that. And I'm going to say to them, I have to disclose that. So I would prefer if we get in front of that now and take care of that and remedy that now. And if we remedy it now before on the market, you can have a handyman fix that XYZ problem. You can have the termite company come out and treat it. And then I'll have those reports to give to people to show that we have remedied that issue. Once we're under contract with a buyer, only licensed contractors are going to be able to fix things. So let's get in front of all these things that need to be fixed and get them fixed. Okay, obviously I'm not saying have a handyman fix a structural problem. That's not what I'm saying. But if the toilet is loose, you can have a handyman tighten the toilet. If the doorknob's loose, have the handyman fix the doorknob. Okay. So when you are working with your client, let's go with seller first. I'm the listing agent. I work with the seller. What do I owe that seller? I owe that seller my experience, my value as a real estate agent, and I obviously owe them treating them honestly. And I have to tell them everything I know that would help them in the sale of their home. So if the buyer's agent who's bringing me an offer says to me, hey, Ashley, this buyer's a very strong buyer. I know we put in there that they're only doing a 10% down payment, but I know they could go to a 20% down payment. I'm going to tell that to my seller because I work for that seller. They should know that. Our counter offer may be, we want a 20% down payment on your mortgage. That will give us a little extra buffer there in case the appraisal comes in low. And I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask myself, who do I represent? I represent the seller. I do not represent that buyer. So I'm going to share that information with my seller. Now let's talk about if I represent the buyer. If I represent the buyer and I know something about that house, and this happens to me all the time. If I have the exclusive, and this is why I tell my buyers, I want to have an exclusive right to represent buyer agreement signed with you. And here's why. If I'm showing my buyer a house and I had another client under contract on it at some point, and I know something about that house, like, we actually had to terminate our contract on that one because we went over there for the home inspection and there was 3 inches of water in the basement. I'm going to tell that to my buyer because I have an exclusive right to represent buyer agreement signed with my buyer. I now represent that buyer. That is who I represent. I owe them that information. Okay. If they were just a buyer customer who I was meeting out there, I would probably have a disclosure obligation because I know about the water in the basement, but I wouldn't have an obligation to a buyer customer about confidential items. If I had had another buyer client under contract on that house and I knew that the sellers were divorcing and I knew that they were going to go into foreclosure if they didn't sell it soon, and my previous buyer clients terminated the contract and were released, and now I have a new buyer client wanting to look at that house, if they have an exclusive right to represent buyer agreement signed with me, I'm allowed to tell them everything I know about those sellers. because I'm no longer a sub agent to the seller, and that buyer is no longer a customer to me. So I may share that information with them about the seller. That type of interaction would never have happened in the last 15 years because we had too many houses to sell. Statistically, I was not going to have two buyers wanting the same house. Now that could happen. So every step of the way, who do I represent? And if you have a question about whether you should or should not share something, call me and let's just run through it. It'll take a 2-minute phone call and you'll know you've done the right thing. Okay. All right. Who has questions about that? I warned y'all. Thick and boring, but very, very important.